Hello folks, I hope that you are having just a great day today. And today we're taking a look at Shieldbreaker's story, which is the last in the Complete Book of Swords series. And includes the first trilogy, the Complete Book of Swords, as well as the 8 books in the sequel, the Lost Book of Swords, that each focuses around one of the created swords that are in this sort of story. Now, this is a sequel, if you will, to Empire of the East, which was written in the 70s by Fred Saberhagen. Empire of the East was a science fantasy that set place in a future Earth after post-apocalyptic stuff has happened, and something called the Change has happened, which has changed the world to be more fantasy and remove some of the technology, the nuclear bombs, fallout, that sort of thing. That has happened as a result of the things happening. These things happening in Empire of the East is more recently after the change has happened, so there's still lost technology running around, and you're questing for them, and you're seeking for them, and you're using a lot of the lost technology, but there's things like magic and that sort of thing too. Then this Complete Book of Swords series is set in the same world, but it's thousands of years in the future, and you don't need to know what has happened in Empire of the East. And it's much more of a traditional sort of fantasy story. There's wizards, there's dragons, there's magic swords, there's gods that are living and are a key part of the world. So there are a lot of these different things that are happening that definitely feel more like a traditional sort of science fiction, a traditional fantasy story rather than the science fiction parts that Empire of the East has to it. And you don't need to have read Empire of the East first. Even though they're set in the same world, they're so far apart that you don't need to read them until Shieldbreaker's story, which is a genre shift back to science fantasy. Not as hard as Empire of the East, but it's a genre shift back to science fantasy. So it's going to wind up happening. A spoiler alert for the previous book, so I'm going to give you about 3 or 4 seconds to pause it if you haven't read the previous book, Farslayer's story. Actually, I'm sorry, it's Wayfinder's story. Wayfinder's story, pause, okay. Near the end of the previous book, the big bad of the entire series has died. And I thought that maybe they were going to bring him back for the final book, make it look like he died. He cast a spell. He's the most powerful, person of his era. Maybe he cast a spell or so forth. But that's not actually happening. So they have to switch who the bad guy is for the final book. They've decided the Dark King, who escaped with the Mind Sword, and so he has one of the most powerful of the swords, the Mind Sword, which requires everybody who sees it to follow that person if they're within a certain range. And we know that anybody this will affect humans, demons, gods, of abilities affected by Mind Sword's power, and will appeal themselves to the person who is wielding Mind Sword, so he uses it. We're going to wake up 2 years after he exited stage earlier in the series, and he's on the moon, which we'll find out at the end of the first chapter. And there's a lot of these sort of old technological things around him, old relics from the ancient age of technology, when that was a big thing. And he's now in basically a lunar colony, and he's going to start exploring the lunar colony. And he's going to find a group of demons that have been imprisoned there. He releases them, controls them with Mind Sword, and in the second chapter they're going to find a spacecraft that is still on the moon and still works, and they're going to fly back to the Earth. So in the first chapter or two, we're ratcheting into science fiction territory rather than traditional fantasy. So the series takes a turn into a different genre. Now, it already did that in Stonecutter's story. It took a turn into a detective mystery story, where we're trying to find out who stole a sword, and we're following along with it throughout the entire book, rather than which has no combat in it or something like that. It's actually just more of a mystery style story with those sorts of trends and tropes. So that we've already done a turn in one of the sorts of the series, but we went back to traditional fantasy after that. But in this one, we're back into science fiction fantasy territory. It's the first book in the Swords series that is science fantasy rather than just traditional fantasy. So it has that sort of feel to it. You also learn a lot of things about what happened with the change, who Arneh was. A lot of those things you'll find out here in this book as well, that are revealed to our main characters. So there's a lot of that sort of thing that's going to happen over the course of this storyline. You'll find out who the Emperor is. You'll find out who's been a main player a kingmaker, if you will, behind the scenes. You'll find out what happened to Arneh, if Arneh's still alive or not. You'll find out a lot of these sorts of things throughout the entirety of. You'll run into traffic. You'll run into a lot of these things. A lot of major characters. There aren't any new point of view characters, with the possible exception of Steven, who's been a character. He's one of Mark's sons, but he is a brand new character, for point of view character, but he hasn't been. He previously was a supporting character, so he goes from being a supporting character to a point of view character. But there aren't any other brand new characters that are created for this story, like Fred Saberhagen typically will do. In this one, I think he just wants to tie up some of the scenes. Again, I think it was bad that he, did what he did in a previous book, which I already mentioned for you in my spoiler warning, because I think it removed that sort of a clash at the end of the final series. The series does make some decisions that I disagree with, and concludes the story in a few ways that I disagree with. But I do like the end and how the story is finalized. But I think that there are some decisions that he makes that I disagree with from a reader standpoint. But I enjoyed a lot of things he does. He's a good writer, and this is a good thing. And I don't mind an author who genre shifts stories in the course of a series. It's a long series. It takes a while, right? I don't mind an author who genre shifts in order to focus on some other stuff. So I have no issues with the fact that it went from traditional fantasy to science fantasy in the final novel. That was actually pretty common at the time. That happened in video games like the Might and Magic series of video games, or the original version of Ultima, which in Ultima 1 has you realize that you're actually in a science fiction world. It also happened in books a lot too. It happens they cross their streams in Dungeons and Dragons novels. And Dungeons and Dragons modules where a fantasy world will have a spaceship that lands in it. And that happens with Mystara, famously, which has a spaceship that crashes into it. It also happens with a very famous module in the traditional TSR homeworld of Greyhawk 2. So, I mean, it's Barrier to the Peaks, Expedition to the Barrier Peaks, and so there's a lot of science fiction-y combinations to your fantasy anyway that's happening during this time in the 70s and 80s when this stuff's being written. And Empire of the East is being written too in the 70s, in the earlier 70s, actually in the Appendix N, where Fred Saberhagen appears, where he was very influential in Dungeons and Dragons and through that modern fantasy. So this is stuff that's very influential on, sort of the modern fantasy, and so he's a name that's one that's definitely come to stood the test of time, in my opinion. This series, the first trilogy, was the second adult book I read after the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R. Tolkien. It's something that's very, very precious to me. I don't think that just because he ends things on this one, or does a genre shift, that I'm going to change my rating. I think it's a 7 out of 10. I think it's very well done and very well written. So that's Shieldbreaker's story. I'll go ahead and leave you to it. Have you read the novel? Anything in the series? I would be happy to engage with it further in the comments below, whether you agree or disagree with my take on this novel. Further, I would be more than happy to engage with it further in the comments below. If you like this video, please feel encouraged to hit that subscribe button. There's going to be a lot more of these to follow. And finally, hey, I just want to thank you for taking some time out of your day and watching Investigate my video. We all have so many things that are happening in our lives, and we're being pulled in so many different directions. So the fact that you spent this time with me is incredibly humbling, and I appreciate it. So thanks again, and have a great day.